Okay, in this video I'm going to show you how to put a new LCD in an old Cirklon. The earlier Cirklon models have an LCD display that has a silver or chrome coloured display around the outside, and the backlights in these displays weren't particularly good, and a lot of them have gone dim by now. So it's possible to fit the newer type of display that's been used for a long time now in the Cirklons. In the newer Cirklons, the display has a 3-pin backlight cable, but we modify some of the newer displays and put the old 2-pin connection on them and make a slight change to the pin out there so that they'll work in the old machines. So the kit for putting that in comes with the LCD module, the acrylic window with an anti-reflective coating on it, and some spacers just in case there's not enough space between the display and the panel because the dimensions are slightly different. So if you'll see, if I put this machine on, the display on here is quite dim in this one. This is actually one of the pre-production machines from 2010, so it's been about a while. Okay, so to do the job we need a 2mm hex driver and a Posi 2 screwdriver. First thing to do is open the machine up. The early machines only have this single screw in the front panel above the middle of the display. There's also some of the early machines that have the 2 screws in there. I'm not sure exactly whether any of the machines with the 2 screws still have the older display, but you'll know that you have the older display because of the chrome surround and probably the dim backlight. So again, these early machines have 5 screws in the blanking plate and the rear panel. The newer machines only have 4 screws. So first step is to get the blanking panel off the bottom. And then we can take the rear panel off. Now, never undo the screw that goes through the front panel here because there's a nylock nut on the inside there, and if you loosen that, it's a real pain in the neck to get it tightened up again. The screw you want to remove is the one going through the rear panel, and it will also be a shorter screw in that hole, so keep track of the one that's shorter to go back in there because it has less clearance inside where the other screw and the nut are. Okay, so once the rear panel is loose, you can bring this round, and at that point you should be able to disconnect the earliest machines have 2 cables onto 2 separate PCBs in the rear panel. Later machines went to a single connector that goes onto the back, but either way you need to disconnect those connectors and also disconnect the cable from the CVIO board if one is fitted. Now, these old connectors might have some hot glue on them to hold them in, which you might need to just sort of pick off before you're able to get those connectors out. So once we have the rear panel off, we need to take the front panel off. So remember, don't try and loosen that screw, you'll have a problem later. Also, if any of the screws you find are quite tight as you're trying to unscrew them, move on to another screw because you might find that once some of the other screws are loosened off, a screw that was tight is less tight because there's more movement in the panel and it's not the panel's holes not pressing against the side of the screw. Okay, so once all the screws are out around the outside of the panel, you need to lift it, push it slightly to one side, and then lift up this end just so that the board there will clear the inside of the chassis. Putting it back on, it's the same thing. You need to kind of hook the board under one edge of the chassis, and then it'll go in, and then it'll slide back into the middle. So if we'll take that out, put the chassis to one side, Next you'll need to get your main board off. First we'll disconnect the backlight connector and the LCD cable from the main board. This is actually a really old main board, but they all have the screws in the same position. You might either have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or just 3 screws, depending on when your particular machine was made. It only really needs the 3. So once the screws are out, the main board attaches onto the front panel board by these 2 headers here. So what you need to do is put your fingers against the board, grab hold of the main board in line with these connectors and just gently work it up off those connectors so it comes free. And this gets us in at the old LCD module. So the LCD module has 4 screws in it. You'll notice that a couple of these screws have a plastic washer underneath them. That's because these old displays have some PCB tracks that actually run very close to where the screw holes are. It's not a great design. If you look there, those tracks are almost at the screw hole, and because we used screws that have a built-in shape-proof washer without the nylon washer, that washer can sometimes cut into the track, cut through the solder resist on the track and short circuit it. But the newer modules have proper mounting pads for the screws to go in, so when you put the new display in, you don't need these old plastic washers. There's another one up here because that has a track that runs close to the screw as well. Again, I'm just going to get rid of that washer. So in the earliest machines, the acrylic window for the display is just a flat piece of acrylic that will be taped onto the module itself, which is then, once that's in place, it's sort of recessed into the front panel. There's a gap around here. For the later machines, we had these nice acrylic windows made up, which have a sort of beveled surround and an anti-reflective coating on them. So with the kit for the new LCD module, let's get rid of the old one, bring in the new one. You'll get one of these windows and it fits into the front panel and comes up. The surface of it will be flush or slightly protruding from the front panel rather than being inset in. So that window comes with double-sided tape on it. So to fit the window, you just need to peel the backing off the double-sided tape, which is always a fiddly job. And just fit that in. A bit of pressure on the tape to get it to hold in place. Now, before we're going to put the display in, we need to remove the protective film from the display and the protective film from the back of the window. The protective film on the display will come off and the display should be totally clean underneath there. You want to be very careful once you've got the protective film off not to get any fingerprints or pick up any dust or anything in there, because once it's sandwiched against the display in the machine, it's very difficult to clean that up. The protective film also comes off the back of this plastic window. Sometimes there's a little bit of kind of residue that will remain on the back of the window, and you might want to give it a little polish up. Again, this is like the double-sided tape, it's hard to get this film off. But I'm just going to stop at that point before I take this off, just to show another point about the new displays. Some of the older machines, the machining for this pocket in the back of the front panel is not as deep as it is on the later machines. And if you just fit the LCD display directly on there, you find that there's actually, the display is pressing right against the new window, and there's a little sort of ½ mm gap between the PCB and the mounting point here that the screw is going to screw into. If you fit the screws in like that, then it will bend the corners of the PCB up. which wouldn't really be a problem except for the fact that the contacts that connect from that PCB into the liquid crystal glass are on a what we call a zebra connector along there, and bending the PCB at all can affect the connections there and cause problems with the display. So to avoid any such problems, your kit will come with a set of little plastic spacers, and these fit over the mounting posts and are just 1 millimeter longer than the mounting posts there. So if you fit these 4 spacers on, there will then be a small gap between the front of your new display and the back of the plastic window, and when the screws are in, there'll be no pressure on the display circuit board. So as I said, when I take this protective film off the inside here, I will usually give the back of that window a bit of a clean up with this is a microfiber cloth that's specifically meant for cleaning up things like acrylic windows without scratching them at all. You need to be careful not to use just an ordinary duster or something that might have any grit on it, because it will very likely scratch the inside of that display window. So with the protective film off the inside of the window, I'll take the protective film off the LCD display and then sit the LCD in place. So the ribbon cable connector is up in the left hand side here. I'm just going to pop these 4 screws back in. As I said, the new displays have these proper pads for the screws to tighten against, so you don't need the plastic washers. They don't need to be hugely tight, they just need to be tight enough that the washer gets a grip and won't loosen off over time. So you see with the spacers in it, that display board is now sitting slightly higher than the UI board next to it, and there's just about a half to 1 millimeter of a gap between the new display and the acrylic window. So at this point I'm going to just get a corner there, take the protective blue film off the front of the new window, just have a look at it to make sure I've not got any dust inside. Actually a little bit of fur hair in there, but not enough to bother me. If you do get a little bit of fluff or something in there, now would be the time just to take the display back off and just catch it with your cloth and take it out. Once the machine's closed up again, then foreign objects will tend not to get in there. And if you don't care whether there's a little bit of dust in there, then it won't matter. So with the new display in, ribbon cable goes back on. There's no shroud on that, so check that it is aligned on the correct set of pins. The main board goes back in, which you want to look through the mounting holes for the main board and make sure that they are lining up with the standoffs underneath, and you'll know that your headers here are then on the right place on the pins on the UI board. We can connect our cables back in, put our mounting screws back in the main board just to hold it tight on the back of the UI board. Now at this point I'm going to point out the contrast trimmer, which you'll see here. The contrast trimmer will almost certainly need to be adjusted to suit the new display because it's a different make of display to the old display. That can be a bit of a problem for these early machines that you'll see. the access to that trimmer is wanting a small screwdriver in from behind. But this is a pre-production machine. The later machines actually have a vertical trimmer that's pointing up there, and you can reach it with a screwdriver from this direction. Basically, when we're putting the machine back together, in this case, I'm going to have to put it back together such that I can get at that contrast adjustment before I finally put all the screws in and secure it to the front panel. But obviously I'll need to have the rear panel connected in so that I can power the machine up. So the way that I'm going to do that is by, without screwing the panel on, I'm just going to connect these two connections from the rear panel back onto the main board. Get that one in. I'm going to put this one screw back in the middle here to hold it, and then at this point I can actually take the front panel and the rear panel back off, just as like this. Don't need the CVIO plugged into this point, and I can put the power in at this point and power the machine on. And you'll be able to see that the screen is brighter, but that the contrast is way up there. So the third tool that I didn't mention. So one more tool that I didn't mention is a little small screwdriver for the contrast trimmer. Some of the contrast trimmers actually use the same 2mm hex driver as you'll have taken your chassis apart with. But you'll see, I don't know if you can see there, that adjustment gives you quite a wide range of adjustment of the contrast. So you basically want to look at it from your usual position that you look at the display from and adjust it to give you a nice contrast. You see that looks okay there. Power that off and put it back into the chassis. So as I said, in other machines you may not need to put the rear panel on because you'll be able to access the contrast trimmer from above. So in fact, with the rear panel connected but not screwed together, you might be able to get into the contrast trimmer from above with your 2mm screwdriver like this. You just need to have a look at the machine and see where see what type of trimmer, whether it's a flat screwdriver or a hex screwdriver that's needed, and what angle you need to come at it from. So plug the CVIO back in there. Put this rear panel screw in. I'm going to refit the front panel screws. Just put these in loosely to start with until they're all in. That makes it easier to get the panel in the right position. If you put them in and tighten them up straight away, then you might find that the panel's not quite in the right position for some of the screws to easily get into their holes. Once all of them are in, then you can just tighten them off. Again, they don't want to be too tight at all. It's not like it's a car or something where it's any kind of safety from having these tightened up, and if you tighten them up too hard, then they can actually tighten themselves up over time and become really difficult to open. Stage just to put the rear blanking panel on with the countersunk screws. So that's this finished, contrast adjusted, and you should notice when it powers up there, it's a much brighter looking display than it was before we replaced it.